Today, I just want to talk a little bit about the ego. I want to clarify a bit more about what the ego actually is and what you can do to work with the ego as opposed to against it. You'll probably see that there is a lot of conversation in the spiritual community, even in the psychology community, about the ego and the talk of destroying the ego or getting rid of the ego. When we take this approach, we tend to work against the ego, and that doesn't ever really result in a harmonious life or a peaceful life. We're always at war with the ego. It's just like what you resist persists. And so you've got two forces pressing against one another. What I want to talk to you about today is how you can actually work with the ego to then let it go. How you can work with the ego to then allow it to dissolve. You don't have to dissolve it. It will dissolve on its own when you are just able to observe it, when you're able to work with it and have compassion for it, and ultimately just see that it's not you. Because the real trick of the ego is when we believe that we are this voice in our head, which you can call ego. So in essence, a simple way to look at it is there are really two parts of us from which we can operate from in this human life. The true part of us, the truth of who we are, is soul, also known as pure awareness, pure consciousness. You can call it spirit, whatever you like. There is this part of us that is beyond the mind. It is behind the mind always. And it is observing thought. It is observing all emotion. It observes the external world and everything. And this is who we truly are. But part of being a human incarnated on this particular timeline is having a strong ego and always falling into identification with it until we transcend this paradigm of living from the ego. And the ego is really this part of us that believes we are a separate self. It believes that I am Vish and you are who you are. And I am this tall, I belong to this religion or to this nationality. And the list goes on and on. The ego will identify with everything, like this is my house, this is how much I'm earning, I'm a spiritual teacher. It can make an identity out of anything. And it will tie its self-worth into this identity. That's not a problem within itself. It's not actually an issue when the ego does that. However, the issue comes when we identify with these labels. Because as soon as we believe that we are a separate self, we are fully open to suffering. We are vulnerable to suffering. And not only that, but we will project our own insecurities, our own traumas that we've collected throughout life onto other people. We'll project it into the world. And when we do this, we are just contributing to the collective suffering. Not only the collective suffering, but we're creating our own suffering. And when we suffer, the collective suffers because we are all connected. I like to look at the ego from a very compassionate standpoint because I always see that my ego is trying to protect me. When we're raised, we collect trauma throughout our lives. From the time that we are born, we're born into a world where our I guess you'd say, our karma or our incarnation leads us down a path of collecting traumas. And when we collect these traumas over time, they become buried deep in the subconscious. They become buried so deep that we don't even know they're there. But the way they show themselves and rear their head is when we just snap out of nowhere and get angry. Or somebody says something and we feel a pit in our stomach and we get really sad. What the ego does then is it externalizes our trauma onto somebody else. So it will say, that person made me angry or that person made me sad. And if they just didn't do that thing, I wouldn't feel this way. And it's trying to protect us from feeling this pain that has been stored in us since childhood. The only problem with that is as long as we are externalizing our pain, we are never dealing with it, and it is always going to be there, blocking us on an energetic level, which then manifests on the physical level. It blocks us from creating the life we want and attaining the things we want in the physical world. It can prevent us from having amazing relationships. It can prevent us from receiving abundance. It can prevent us from so many things. Now, the way to heal this is to just be aware when the ego is coming up. And thank the ego. Say, thank you for trying to protect me. The ego is really defending our separate sense of self. The ego ties our separate sense of self into our safety. It actually thinks survival is us maintaining this identity, because the ego identity is its life. And as soon as we start seeing the ego's identity for what it is, it will begin to dissolve. And as soon as it begins to dissolve, it starts to freak out. It starts to grab onto anything it can. And this is why pain comes up in a stronger way. For anyone that has done ego work and has seen their ego start to dissolve, you will know that it's not just an easy feel-good process. It's actually very painful. Because as the ego dissolves, it will grasp onto everything for life, and the pain and the trauma that you've been feeling will actually amplify. But the key here is that you see your ego. You create the separation between you and the separate self. And you start practicing living in a place of soul more, a place of pure awareness. And there's ways you can do this, like you can meditate. You can do yoga. You can start journaling to create more awareness of your patterns. The important thing is that you just see the separation between you and your ego. And in that separation, the ego will begin to dissolve. However, when you see the separation and you see your ego come up, it's really important to do your best to just not buy into that pattern. So let's say that you get triggered. Somebody says something and a wave of sadness just hits you. And then your ego starts going and saying, they did that to me. They don't understand what I've been through. I would feel good if it wasn't for them. Just take a breath and pause right there. Just come back into your body. Become really present with what you're feeling. And just notice that that is your ego. Take ownership. Because as soon as you take ownership, it's not you anymore. As you start to resist the patterns of the ego that habitually come up and not act on them, it will get stronger. And the pull will get stronger because now these energetic patterns that have been pretty much running your life unconsciously forever are starting to lose their power. And when they start to lose their power, they just grab at anything they can. It's almost like this energy starts to spin even faster to get your attention. But just stay strong and act from a different place. A great question to ask yourself is, how would I behave in this situation if I was behaving like my higher self? Would I react? Would I blame somebody else? And ask yourself these questions and know that this is the place you need to come from to let go of the ego. And this becomes your North Star. So at a moment when it's really crazy and your energy is coming up, this past energy, this old you is coming up, not your energy, but the ego energy. Know in that moment that that's not you. And sometimes it's difficult in that moment to know that, but as long as you've asked yourself, how will my higher self act in this situation? You'll have way more clarity, way more guidance. And then you can start to behave from that place where your higher self resides, that deeper place within you. So if you know your higher self wouldn't blame somebody else, just notice that you're blaming someone else, the ego is blaming someone else, and you're becoming identified with it, and then just don't engage in that anymore. And when you see that the pain is coming up, don't identify with it. Allow yourself to fully feel it, yes, because the pain just needs to be felt, but don't take ownership of it. Don't say that this is me, I am sad. Because what would your higher self do here? Continually ask that question and live from that place. So really, the message I just want to get across today is that your ego will come up. It's a part of being human and a part of being incarnated in this life. Yet we can transcend the ego, and not in a spiritual bypassing way where we think we must transcend the ego. It's just simply saying that we can allow it to dissolve because it will only stay around as long as we feed it energy. But just remember that it's trying to help you. The ego has always tried to help you because it thinks that your separate sense of self is who you are. And if you lose your separate sense of self, then you will die. Once you're aware that this isn't true, you can start to act from a more compassionate place and just see the ego as a scared child. See the ego as someone trying to defend your inner child and protect it from being hurt anymore. But now that we are transcending and we are ascending, we don't need protection from pain. Let's face our pain. Let's be with our pain, and let's see the ego as it is and give it nothing but love and compassion. It will dissolve when ready. You will transcend when ready. But the important thing for now is that you are simply aware. You simply see it when it comes up. You also see it in scenarios when it compares you to other people, because that's another thing the ego loves to do. The ego will try to raise you up on a pedestal while putting somebody down, and it will also put you down when it sees somebody else raising up. It's trying to protect you from feeling pain again by saying, well, you're not worthy, you couldn't do this. The ego goes both ways. Remember, just see it with compassion, observe it, ask yourself, what would my higher self do here? And then do your best to just act from that place.